welcome everyone to the first class of So You Wish to Learn All About Economics class series. My name is Frank. I am a engineering grad student here in Canada, and I've been with the LaRouche movement for about 5 months. And we refounded the LaRouche Youth Movement about 3 months ago, and I've been working and volunteering with them ever since.
My name is Isaiah Madrigal. I've also been with the LaRouche movement for maybe 6 months, and I'm from Texas. And yes, I'm also part of the LaRouche Youth Movement. Excited to be here.
All right, next slide, please. So just a quick overview of what we're going to do in the next hour. First, we'll go over the structure of the course for the next 4 weeks. And then we're going to go over the first 2 chapters of So You Wish to Learn About Economics, which is the book that this class is based on. And the topics we'll cover is why is physical economics needed, which is covering the present situation of the world. We're going to give you some historical context and the important figures that led to these discoveries that we're about to present you. And then we're going to cover topics such as the idea of economics as energy, and the concepts of energy flux density and potential relative population density. Next slide, please. So the structure of the course is it's a 5-week course, which is based on the book So You Wish to Learn All About Economics, which was written by LaRouche in 1984, as well as the video The Power of Labor. The first class, so class 0, was last week, where we watched the video The Power of Labor. It's freely available on YouTube, so if you haven't seen that video yet, you can go and check it out anytime. We can, if you would like, we can post that link into the chat. And as for the book, we would highly recommend you, get the book. You can get it on Amazon or anywhere, but it is not completely necessary, but it is recommended. And all of these courses will be taught by members of the LaRouche Youth Movement members and will be supervised by Jason Ross. And Jason Ross was the science advisor to Lyndon LaRouche. And for these classes, we would like it to be a mix of presentations and open discussion. So please feel free to ask any questions. You can interrupt us. You can raise your hand and so on because it would really broaden your understanding if you have any sort of questions or if you have even any disagreements with some of the ideas that we presented here. And I really welcome any sort of questions and challenges to the content. And we actually do have some homework to do between classes. Now, this homework is not like, we're not expecting to write essays or do any sort of like math problems, anything like that. These are just questions for you to consider going out of the class and applying it to the world, because ultimately these are ideas for you to analyze the present situation and what you could do in your local communities and in the country. All right, next slide, please. So the goals of this course, according to the book, according to actually book itself, 2 quotes, was it is meant to be used as a manual for use by government officials and leading advisors to the government. So these proposals are quite serious, and it is meant, and it is based upon policies by past officials of the American government, specifically people like Henry C. Carey and Alexander Hamilton and many other past American presidents. The text also gives excellent forewarning of what the policies of the United States might become. So this was during the period where LaRouche, he was actually running for president, and he had many people running for various local elections at the same time. And these are the policies that he planned to implement if he were to become president or become very influential with the administration. Now today, unfortunately, Mr. LaRouche is no longer with us, but his movement lives on in the LaRouche Youth Movement and the Schiller Institute, and these are the policies that we plan to bring into the United States if we were to gain some sort of influence or be able to maybe even have a Senate seat with the campaign that's going on right now with Diane Sayre. Now, to update this, it's also a framework for understanding what's going on in the world today. The situation is a lot more, I would say, is a lot more dire than it was in 1984. I'll get into that very soon, but there are a lot of problems going on in the world, and it is useful. This book is useful to understand why it's happening and what the future might look like. And of course, for everyone here, our ultimate goal is to be able to allow you to actually create policy and program ideas which would solve the present crisis, and to make you into a LaRouche youth movement leader and a leader in the world. Next slide, please. So the present crisis in terms of the military situation is not looking very good. Everyone knows about the escalation of the Ukrainian conflict, and it doesn't look like that war will be over very soon, despite some people always saying Russia is about to collapse and nonsense like that. The most recent escalation was the United States government basically saying that they have active duty deployed troops in Ukraine, which is quite a serious situation if, for example, they were to be killed in some sort of missile strike or things like that. Of course, there's also been the tensions in the Taiwan Straits, as well as the most recent sanctions being put on China, which is basically the system trying to escalate, trying to start another war on the other side of the planet with China over Taiwan. And this is an extremely serious situation as well. Both of these situations could potentially lead to nuclear war, which would pretty much be the end of humanity as we know it. And beyond this, we have also seen various, coups and revolutions around the world. I mean, I could count 3 at least this year. And I don't know if that would possibly break a record for the most number of coups and color revolutions attempts in 1 year, but it certainly is a lot. Next slide, please. And behind all of this, we also have the domestic economic situation. We are now seeing historical levels of inflation in North America and Europe. Here on the right, you can see this chart, which is the situation of inflation in Europe. And currently, energy is approaching levels of 50% in October. But as have every other industrial good as well, it's getting into the double digits percentage. It is much worse in some countries than others, but I think this really hides the reality that it's not just increased prices, they're just straight up shortages of things such as fuel. There's been power outages, there's shortages of goods that we have seen here in North America as well. I mean, it's happened since the start of pandemic, but it's been steadily going up. And at the same time, reflective of this, all the sort of mainstream newspaper like Bloomberg, Fortune, Forbes, all of them have been predicting a global recession this year. Now we're in November, so there's maybe they're wrong, but there's only 1 month left to the year, and it would imply that they don't think we're actually in the recession quite yet. So it just shows how bad this upcoming recession, depression might be, considering that things aren't going so well either. And if you look at this chart on the bottom right, this kind of shows, this kind of hints at what was the cause of some of these issues. This is the money stock. So if you can see, there's a sharp spike up in 2020 with the pandemic, where the Federal Reserve just started releasing huge amounts of money into the economy, which is causing all of these sort of problems as well. Okay, next slide, please. So it might be useful to kind of understand the background of why are we here. I mean, there's a million different reasons, all of which you could say it was or wasn't, but we present we present this story. So it started in 1971 when Nixon ended the gold standard, and what this allowed was at the time the U.S. dollar was basically pegged to gold, but as soon as he ended the gold standard, it allowed a huge amount of debt and so on to be to be used in speculative activity. I mean, over the next few decades, the amount of money going into the stock market and things like derivatives just completely exploded, and it reached even higher in the 90s, and it went up, and it's been going up ever since. And today, you'll have different sort of numbers given out for how much. What's the value of all these derivatives in the various stock markets around the world? But the notional value, which is kind of what they are on paper, is 1 quadrillion. which is really crazy. That 1 quadrillion is 1,000 billion, which is 1,000 million. And the only way you can really stop the sort of inflation that's going on with this is through sort of austerity measures, where the government basically has to reduce the standard of living of the population to try and prevent runaway inflation from all of this speculative activity, which is part of the reason why you're seeing all these sort of these plans to instigate war around the world. Next slide, please. All right, so what's going to happen? Where is this all leading? So here we have this classic triple curve function that's been has been a staple of the Schiller Institute, and this is essentially a very simplified model of what happens when a country is run by financial interests that just know how to pump money into a huge derivative and speculation bubble. Here you can see that there's a line representing monetary aggregates and financial aggregates. And the idea is that as you add more money into the system, this often feeds into the financial markets, and thus they go up together. But there is an inflection point where the more money you print, the less that money is worth. And eventually that money actually becomes, so the money goes up faster than the financial aggregates. But then on the line at the bottom, there you have the physical economic input and output. So that is the real economy in terms of goods and services and resources and the things that people need to survive. And as the financial aggregates and the monetary aggregates go up, these sort of speculative activity actually end up hollowing out the real economy. You've already seen this in the United States, where the economy has becoming incredibly financialized. So as the situation increases, as inflation increases, which damages the real economy, which damages the ability of manufacturers and producer and so on to pay their workers and to buy the goods they need to produce their goods, you see it is what you call a collapse function. It basically goes down exponentially until the system crashes. And this is why we're giving this class today. We're more or less on the eve of what we would call the collapse of the system. I mean, if it's not this winter, it's going to be next winter, and if it's not next winter, it's going to be the winter afterwards. Because there's really not many ways that we can see the system going. How is it going to bail itself out? Is it going to go through a war and put really extraneous austerity measures on the population to try and prevent this sort of collapse function from happening? The populations of people around the world are already in an uproar. Europe and Germany and France, you can see many sort of protests against the government's policies, and you can see that there are some countries which are even breaking ranks from this system that they're from this trajectory that they're being put on. So we are giving you this class today and for the next few weeks to try and educate you on what's happening and how do you actually fix the system once this happens, or to prevent all of this from happening in the first place, if we can. All right, and I'll give the presentation over to Isaiah, and he will go through the introduction to the actual book of the first chapter.
Okay. It's an introduction about Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. Ultimately, I think it's important to recognize that not only is our economic system idiotic, it's also less important to recognize that economic and idiotic rhyme, but also the yardstick in which we measure GDP is just as insane. What is economics? What is mankind? What is science? What is justice? Leibniz was a fighter for what ended up becoming the American Republic. He was a scientist. He worked to unify the different denominations of the church. He was a statesman. He was an economist who developed a beautiful view of the world. Unfortunately, many of us have never heard of him. And many of us have never had a universal historical understanding of the world or of the United States. Consider the latest development over the last millennia, scientific discoveries in the last millennia. Do we know them? Do we understand them? Could we teach them to someone else? I think what Jason Ross and many scientists of the past and now, what I'm sure they believe is that these discoveries are our birthright to be able to understand. This is the goal of education. This should be the point of the universities, answering these questions. Where did we come from? And as a good friend, Zaira asked in the last class 0, she asked, is progress necessary? If so, how and why do we move forward? Gottfried Leibniz developed a scientific conception of Christian economy. In this essay, Society and Economy, he argues that the entire purpose of society is to release the artisan from his misery. To accomplish this, Leibniz proposes that society play a positive role in fostering a harmony of interest among merchants and artisans through the development of national industry. In the laissez-faire free market system of monopoly capital, in which artisans are kept in continual poverty and toil, they are relatively unproductive. However, in a society which considers artisanship one of the worthiest occupations, where the highest rule shall be to foster love and the moral virtues shall be promulgated, the workforce will be more productive to the benefit of society as a whole. He says, if this conception were to exist in all countries, no country will be favored over the other. Rather, each shall be made to flourish in these areas in which God and nature have allowed it to excel. Meaning, although the tropics are tropical, trying to grow food underneath the canopies without sunlight probably isn't the best idea. Should we invest money in other countries? Leibniz says, by no means. On the contrary, each country will find and supply itself with those necessary commodities and manufacture goods which previously come from abroad, so that it will have to produce from others what it can for itself. So it will not have to procure from others what it can have for itself. Each country shall be shown how to properly use its own domestic resources. First of all, if a man is unsure of his own sustenance, he has neither the heart nor the spirit for anything. He will produce only as much as he expects to sell, and does not have the heart to undertake anything new or important. And also says, manufacturing, therefore, shall always take place at the commodity's origin, whereas commerce, in accordance with nature, shall be located at rivers and oceans, which only becomes disrupted when manufacturing is placed near commercial centers far from its raw materials, and where there are lacking of republics or functioning societies. This was an excerpt from the last issue of Fidelio. And just to give, I guess, a time frame, he lived from 1646 to 1716 and born in Leipzig, Germany. This was 2 years before the Treaty of Westphalia, which ended a 30-year religious war. And what we discover as a consistent virtue of his life was finding the most universal understanding of life and bettering mankind. In his belief, this goal was not different, but synonymous with a closer relationship to God, a better understanding of God, and glorifying God. He was educated and received a doctorate in law. During this period is when Thomas Hobbes, his book was published in 1651, The Leviathan, which describes the basis of law as a social contract. The Hobbesian view was that we are fundamentally all at war with each other, and we serve to preserve our own sense of peace and defend ourselves from pillaging, pirating, or looting, or what have you. With that rationale, he ascribed creating a society so that we act less beastly towards others, simply so that no one acts that way towards us. In his view, described in the Leviathan, or supreme ruler, that the head of the government has no sense of justice that would apply to him. Through his view, whoever has power is free from responsibility, except trying to maintain that power. Does any of this sound familiar? His view is that justice is a concept. His view is that justice is an empty concept and that the ruler could do anything. Leibniz used Plato's Republic, where Socrates is speaking about justice and interrupted by Thrasymachus, who says, "Justice is the right of the stronger." Excuse me. Leibniz rightly says, if this were so, the same act could be just or unjust, depending on who judges, which is asinine, but would also defeat the idea of there being any good. So with this, he understood that he would need to approach the law with the understanding of natural law. He wasn't interested in legalism or precedence, but that all law must adhere to natural law. Leibniz says that it not only applies to human law, but also the same is true for God. That natural law and goodness is how he makes his decisions. Counterpose his image of God, which in his view, he is omnipotent, yet desiring to do good because it's good is for its own perfection. Contrast this with the Hobbesian view of the Leviathan. During his legal work, he is also studying philosophy and imagining how to improve people's lives. He says the sole end or aim of philosophy is to use in life to increase the power and happiness of mankind. He sought out to create these universal concepts and a way of thinking that includes, and this is Latin, ars judicandi and invendi, the art of deciding and discovery. There can be no understanding of the mind and thought if all were concerned with if something was true or not, without the input of human creativity. Leibniz saw the human mind as an essential part of science. In contradiction, Bacon and Sarpi believe that science and knowledge comes from induction and empiricism. By observing the world around us, we form general concepts that comprehend a number of effects we have seen. Leibniz held that a concept never arises from seeing something happening a million times. And the necessity of that thing happening doesn't come from seeing it happen previously. That whatever may be the cause of these things happening will correspond with a human idea. Our minds are able to create concepts that correspond to the effective powers that actually bring phenomena about in this world. With this goal, he has, and might I mention, is a part of our Constitution, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that our state has a duty to provide happiness for its people, which is different and in opposition of John Locke's view of life, liberty, and property. This goal, Leibniz says, the state of providing happiness, not just security, he mentions where perfection comes from. What would make the decisions God makes? Leibniz says, what is the ultimate basis of divine will? He says it's divine intellect. For God wills those things he perceives to be the best and likewise the most harmonious. And he selects them from the infinite number of infinite number of possibilities, so to speak, what therefore is the basis of the divine intellect. He says the harmony of things. And what is the basis for the harmony of things? He says nothing. For example, there is no reason that can be given for the fact that the ratio 2 to 4 is that of 4 to 8. Not even divine will is the reason for this proportion. It depends on the essence itself, the idea of those things. For essence are like numbers. They contain the very possibility of entities, which God does not bring about as he does, since the very possibility or idea of things coincide with God himself. That was just some, I thought it was some very interesting. It was also like it's a little biography, as well as like how he got his epistemology on some of the things like law and philosophy. And I read that and I thought it was, I had to share it with you all. So yeah, that's what I have. A little biography, where he's from, some of the contrasting views he had of popular figures at the time, and how it's relevant in our own republic. So I'm gonna see if Frank, are you ready? I'm sorry.
Yes, I am.
Okay, go ahead.
Yep. Pull up the presentation when you're ready.
Oh, okay. I thought something was wrong. Let me see. I'm sorry. Share screen and share. Okay. Awesome.
All right. Can you jump to the next slide? We'll skip this one for now.
Okay. Am I not in like full screen?
No, you're not yet. You have to play it. Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay, so this is a question to the audience. All right, story time's over. Now the question is, there's a typo, but can you judge the superiority of one culture over another? Now anyone's free to answer, and there's no wrong answers here, but
Yes.
okay, how would you do so? No, okay.
Are you saying maybe like Chinese culture is better than Mexican culture? What do you want to say?
Am I saying that? I don't know.
I don't know. What are you trying to say?
Well, I think that you could tell from what we learned in the video that we watched last week, and it's, who fits the standard of being fruitful and multiplying. And with the video we watched, he went through how you could tell if a society is fruitful. And I think that you can make that judgment, although some people say that we're supposed to have cultural relativism, but I'm sorry, but people wallowing in their filth and dying and not being fruitful is you can't excuse that just by saying, oh, that's their culture.
That's quite the assertion. All right, well, next slide, please. Let's see what LaRouche had to say about this, and not just him, but all the other figures that Isaiah went through. Next slide, please.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry. Previous slide. Okay. So here is a quote by Henry Charles Carey, the chief economic advisor to Abraham Lincoln, and he was the one who came up with the Continental Railway. So according to him, the true measure of the value of human productive activity is the increase of economy of labor through the aid of technological progress. In other words, labor saving. Now, with that quote in mind, I would like to go through a story. Can you jump 2 slides ahead, please? So imagine you are living in a hunter-gatherer society and you're hungry. So you go out into the forest and you look for food, and you happen it takes you a while, but you eventually happen upon an apple tree, and it takes you some effort to go up there and pick the apples from the tree, after which then you eat that apple. Now, in this activity, you are just limited by the strength of your limbs and your fingers and your hands, and the fruit of your effort, which is the apple itself, eventually nets you more energy than the amount of energy it takes than it took for you to find the apple and eat the apple. And with this extra amount of energy, you're no longer hungry, and you're able to do all the other stuff that you would want to do as a human being. For example, social activity, meeting other human beings, or perhaps building a tool, or perhaps working on your shelter so that you don't freeze. Next slide, please. Now, imagine the next level up from there. Instead of you being one person in a hunter-gatherer society with only the strength of your hands, you're now in a village. And in this village, you have a plot of land on which you can grow food. And besides just working with your hands, you have access to tools. You have things such as shovels, or you have a hoe with which you can till the land and make it easier to harvest the food. And essentially, the amount of food that you grow is more than the amount of energy it takes to produce the tools and to maintain your home and to maintain the land and to actually plant the food. And with the extra amount of energy that you gain from the food compared to growing it, you can actually do things in the village, such as improve irrigation, or you can expand the village, you can have more people in the village, or you can go out and have some people who are not stuck growing food all the time, and they can either spend their time making art, or they can go out and trade with other villages, or try to invent or create new tools and technologies with which you can do your farming more effectively. Next slide, please. And now we come to an industrialized society. And in this society, if you're a farmer, you have access to a tractor, and you also have access to things like fertilizer and other industrialized processes. And instead of being limited to just the tools, which use things such as animal power and the power of your own limbs, now you can actually burn fuel. And this fuel is a source of energy with which you can operate much more sophisticated machines, such as tractors and other cultivation tools and harvesting machines such as these. And now, with very few people working on producing food, you can sustain quite a large population. And at the same time, the same piece of land is now much more productive than previous, with the ability to use fertilizer and more advanced irrigation and herbicides and pesticides and other techniques. Next slide, please. Now, in this story, there are three key concepts that I want to go over. The first one is potential relative population density. In the first example, where the man was basically forced to just go out in the wild and find whatever food that they can, this is a hunter-gatherer society, and the average amount of land that you needed to sustain one person permanently is about 10 square kilometers. In the second and third example, with agriculture and with the ability to gain energy from other sources besides just your muscles and sunlight in the case of agriculture, but also being able to gain energy from fuel such as gasoline or fertilizer, you're able to feed a lot more people on that 10 square kilometers of land. You're able to produce a lot more food, and you're able to net a lot more energy. Now, the second idea I want to go over is energy flux density. And energy flux density can be represented in both, for example, in the example of agriculture, the energy ultimately comes from the sun. The sun is the source of energy for plants, and as well as the nutrients in the soil. And if you were to clear a piece of land for agriculture specifically, you can make sure that all that energy is captured by plants that you want and you can eat. And in that sense, you're actually increasing the amount of energy that can go towards the useful plants. But also in this example of tools in agriculture, things such as a shovel, things such as a scythe, things such as bladed implements, they actually concentrate the amount of force that you apply with your hands into a smaller area. And this allows you to do things such as cut wheat, which would be quite difficult to pull out individually with your hands. But with something like a scythe, you can cut wheat a lot easier. And of course, with much larger combine machines, such as the one you see in this picture, they can apply even a greater amount of force and just basically drive around, collecting wheat as if it was grass. And finally, there's capital intensity, and in that sense, that's simply how much energy you're able to invest into the tools. If in a village where you have much more fertile soil, for example, or you have more advanced techniques, you can actually invest the extra energy into producing more tools or to work on infrastructure for the land, such as irrigation, or to clear more land for agriculture and things like that. And so this illustrates these three key concepts, which I will go into more detail. Next slide, please. So in potential relative population density, it's quite a mouthful. So why do we put potential relative in front of population density? Well, this is the question of how much people could your society sustain on a given piece of land. Now, if you're going to compare societies and land, you must realize that not all land is equal. Some land has more favorable climates. Some land has less favorable climate. Some land is more fertile. Other land is barren and rocky, for example. So not all land is equal. So you have to compare relative population density, because if a society can sustain just as much people on a less fertile piece of land, that society can be considered to be more advanced. Also, at the same time, population is in a current constant state of growing or shrinking, so that the current population on a piece of land does not also always reflect how advanced that society is, because potentially they could sustain a lot more people on that piece of land. So this is why we call it potential relative population density. And this is reliant on things such as infrastructure. Consider things such as water management. You could sustain a lot more people in a place which has access to water or is irrigated, artificially irrigated, with the use of canals, or with roads, or with energy, such as power lines. Also, things such as tool advancements. You can definitely grow a lot more food if you have more advanced tools. And of course, energy sources, whether this society has access to wood or coal or electricity and so on. Next slide, please. Now, I have a question for the audience again. What would happen if you reduced the potential relative population density? Oh, I don't know. Let's say if you were to replace your reliable energy sources with much less reliable energy sources, and had, for example, reduced the amount of food that you grow by limiting the amount of fertilizer that you could use on your farmland.
Then the people get to return to the earth by dying.
Yeah. Yes, they do get to return to Mother Earth in a way, indeed. So there is a book that's written. I think it's called "There Are Limits to Growth," right? Or is that the book is called "Limits to Growth," I believe, and it is a book written by the Club of Rome, which is a very shady group of elites. And they had this plan in that book to reduce the global population to 1 billion people, because they had this idea that 7 billion or whatever many billion people lived at the time they wrote the book was too many, and we needed to reduce the global population because it is easier to control fewer people. So they had this idea that we would implement all these green energy policies, and through a slow process of reducing the ability of society to sustain people would eventually start dying at a higher rate. And we're not talking about a massive famine or a sudden, huge collapse of population. We're talking about a slow process in which people in a society with a reduced potential relative population density would be under things such as more stress from having less financial security, or they would have access to less nutritious food, and therefore die at a higher rate from just normal things such as diseases and all sorts of accidents and things like that. And through this, you would actually be much more effective in sort of reducing the population. So that is the effect of reducing potential relative population density. If you can sustain less people on a piece of land, then if you have more people than that, those people will die. All right, next slide, please. Now, it's one thing to go backwards, but what if you were to actually completely halt technological progress in this case? This is another question to the audience. What if we stopped advancing? What if we stopped, advancing any sort of technology? What if we stopped any sort of new developments in research and science and so on?
Well, LaRouche would say that society would collapse.
Now that's an interesting answer, isn't it?
I think so.
Yeah. Do you think that's true? Like, does that make sense?
No.
No, right? Well, I guess it doesn't initially. I mean, if you think about it, I mean, if you just stopped technological progress, well, you still have the farmland that you have today, right? You still have, cars and things like that. You still have all the natural, you still have oil and coal, and you can keep burning those things and, maintain your society that way. Okay, well, here's something to consider. Next slide, please. So here is an example of the fall of Rome, and it kind of illustrates what happens if you actually stop technological progress in society. And there's several factors to this. One, the resources that you actually have are somewhat limited in a sense that if you don't advance your technology, then, for example, if you were to mine all the coal and all the iron and all the oil, eventually you would run out of the current sources and you would need to find more sources. And all the easiest places to find these resources would be depleted. And this would basically cause is that it would be more and more expensive to find these new sources of your resources. And it's not just limited to things you mine out of the ground. It also includes things such as agriculture, land depletion, right? It also includes things such as lumber and sometimes even human populations. And as this cost increases, you need more and more people to work in these industries, which would actually take away these people availability to work in other places, and it would just overall drive up the cost of labor. And as it becomes more and more difficult to acquire the resources to maintain your society, then you would have a drop in the potential relative population density, and you would see a decrease in population of your society. So one is the issue of labor costs, because it's more difficult to find new sources. And the second one is just sometimes you might actually just run out of resources, right? You might just run out of, if you were to not develop a new technology, then you might not be able to access those deeper veins of coal, which you would need to power your industries. So in the example of the fall of Rome, Rome had a slave society and a model of zero technological progress. And one of the reasons that Rome fell was because what happened was the Italian, as Rome conquered more and more places, they had a huge influx of slaves, cheap available slaves, where the elite Romans bought off the market, and they used in their plantations to create huge amounts of profit. And with these profits, they were able to buy out all the sort of free farmers on the Italian peninsula. The free farmers, by the way, who are the basis of Rome's economic and military engine. They were slowly being replaced by these large plantations owned by these aristocrats, which were worked by slaves. And this had the long-term effect of actually slowly depopulating the Italian peninsula relative to the rest of the Mediterranean. And what this meant was that as Rome's actual power fell in Italy, they would need to find other sources of wealth in other parts of the Mediterranean. And So for example, this would drive the Roman expansion into places like Egypt and Syria and all these and Africa, all these places which had very productive agriculture. But as they expanded this model to other places, slowly these places also saw the same sort of problems. And it was not just the issue of slave labor, it was also the issue of depletion of the land, for example, because the Romans were reliant on things like natural fertilizer and such. And this eventually led to the collapse of Rome. Rome was simply unable to maintain the same levels of productivity and population required to actually man all the fortifications and the armies and pay all the wages of the soldiers and so on. And this eventually just led to the total collapse of Rome, and it was replaced by all the new barbarians, so to speak, who went into all those areas. All right, next slide, please. So how do we actually counteract this process that that Rome went through? But I think in some levels you can actually see having happened in the United States as well. Now, the United States isn't a slave society anymore, obviously, but at the same time, we've seen a sort of hollowing out of the manufacturing of the United States. So how does technology actually, how is it able to actually prevent some of these things from happening? Well, on the issue of increasing costs to acquire resources, technology actually improves the economy of labor, as Henry Carey said, which allows you to decrease the cost of acquiring new resources. If you have better technologies, then it might not actually be that more expensive to mine for coal in deeper places, because in that time your technology advances so much that it becomes cheaper to find coal in more difficult areas. Another thing is technology allows us to use fewer resources more efficiently. Today coal power plants and other things are much more efficient than the older coal power plants of the past. They produce much more energy with less fuel. And the most important part is that technology allows us to use other resources we did not find useful before. So in ancient times, when they found, coal was always present, but coal was only used as a fuel in things such as stoves and the usual the things you would expect in a medieval society. They were not able to use coal as a fuel for driving things such as engines. But with new methods and new technologies and new understanding in physical sciences, they were able to take this thing that was relatively useless. It's basically a better version of wood in a medieval society. They're able to take this thing that was not as useful and make it very, very useful in driving the Industrial Revolution. Next slide, please. And this goes into a concept, this kind of goes into concept of energy flux density. So I just wanted to do a quick definition of what exactly is energy flux density before I get into the significance. But it's a math term. Flux is the idea of flow over a surface area. And if you think about flux density, it's how much flow is over a given surface area. In this case, this is an electric field. And if you think of higher density as basically more electricity going through the same plate, imagine the lines are more concentrated and there's more energy going over that same area. And why is this important? Well, energy flux density allows us to get more work done with less energy. So in the previous example of a society which used tools, that example with the man finding the apple and then the villagers being able to farm, having a tool allows you to, for example, cut wheat with much less energy than it would to pull out the wheat with your bare hands. And it's also related to advancements in technology, of course. The development of things such as knives and bladed tool implements itself is an advancement in technology. And today, of course, we've advanced past that. We have things, for example, instead of a wood cutting axe, we have things such as a chainsaw, which is able to use the rotating blades to put much more energy into the contacted wood that they're trying to cut. Okay, next slide, please. So why is this important how is this connected to what I was just talking about technological progress and counteracting the falling rate of potential relative population density? Well, energy density in this case plays into it. Energy density is in the form of the energy source that you have and fuel. How do you fuel your society? The most basic, the most primitive societies, you would only have access to to wood. And for example, how much fuel of different types provide the same amount of energy as a tank of gas? So in this case, you would actually need to find 300 pounds of wood from the forest to acquire the same amount of energy as a tank of gas. But in somewhat more advanced societies, you're actually able to mine coal out of the ground, and coal is somewhat more efficient than wood, and it only takes 200 pounds of wood to gain the same amount of energy from a tank of gas. And what this means is you simply have access to more energy, and it's less work to actually use these sorts. You're able to basically get a greater amount of energy from less fuel, and it's less work to get the fuel and compare it to the amount of work that you get out of it. And then the next one would be in gasoline, which is what we have now, and nuclear fuel, which is uranium. And quite simply put, it's nuclear fuel is essentially hot rocks that you can put into water and use it to boil and generate steam and drive a turbine. And nuclear fuel is much more efficient than even gas engines and our gas turbines today. And this would represent the next step up in energy flux density. So in our current civilization, we primarily use gasoline, but ideally, because eventually, with that previous example of the Roman Empire, you would actually start to run out of sources of gas. I don't know how long this would take. I mean, gas is a naturally produced substance, but eventually, with growing populations and into the indefinite future, you would eventually run out of gas. So ideally, you would move on to nuclear fuel. And with nuclear fuel, you only need it at least gets harder to extract. So with nuclear fuel, you would only need the weight of a paperclip in something like uranium or plutonium to generate the same amount of energy as a tank of gas. And of course, the future that we look forward to is fusion energy, because fusion energy uses helium, which is the most common element in the entire universe. And you can find that pretty much anywhere. You can find it out of water. And you only need a grain of rice of heavy hydrogen, which is still relatively abundant, to provide the same amount of energy as a tank of gas. Okay, so that wraps up the presentation on these key concepts of potential relative population density, energy flux density, and the quick overview on capital intensity. Okay, and open to any questions you might have. And of course, we also have the homework for the class.
Ooh. Good class.